Okay. It's a very simple test. First, I'll give you the test, and then I'll explain it to you. Okay? Are you ready for the test?
Yes.
Okay. It requires like this, like you said, yes, the same. Okay. So all I need you to do is name the ink color, the color of what I'll show you as fast as possible. Okay? You ready? Out loud. Yeah.
Green, red, yellow, blue, red.
What's wrong? What happened? Did you have coffee or beer? What's going on? Okay. So this is a neuropsychological test that, Dr. Stroop developed. And it's very simple. It's based on the idea that, that once we see a word, we have to read it, because reading is a very strong ability, and it trumps color naming. So when you're a baby, you can name colors, but after you learn to read, if the word is in a color, the first thing you do is you read it, not actually pay attention to the color, okay? So if there's congruence between the color and the name of the color, you have no problem, green, red, yellow. Here, there's no congruence. You want to say blue, but your task is to say red. So it creates a conflict in your mind that takes a bit longer to answer and to fulfill the test than if there's congruence between. And it works the best if I give you a lot of good words like this, green in green fonts, right? And once in a while, I trick you with this word. And then I can measure the amount of time that goes by, right? So the better you do in this task, the less difference in time of responding between these two conditions, okay? So if you have problems with executive functions, it will take you longer to process this. It will take you longer. And that longer that it will take you, it shows in the brain. The difference is shows in the brain, okay? Now, okay, so you're saying, how can I prove there is attention bias using a task like this? Okay? How can I do that? What if I use this word to see if you have attention bias to neuroscience? Brain, lectures, study. So if you use a word, if I use words that are neutral, like table, chair, you know, you'll read them faster. Suddenly you'll see a word that is related to you, to what's important to you. And that will take you slightly longer to respond, because it has salience that is personal, that is subjective. And so perhaps to people with alcohol disorders, I can give a lot of words like table, chair, etc. But then once in a while, I can put in a word like beer, hangover, drunk, or high. Now, the person, remember, the task is to really press the button. You get buttons with all the different colors, and you press the button of the color of the word, okay? But we already know as psychologists that you can't help it. You have to read the word. So you actually are reading the words. And so we use the elements of this task, of the Stroop task. Rita Goldstein used it in an fMRI task. And so this is an example of an fMRI task. For the first 500 milliseconds, there's a fixation. We call it fixation because all you have to do is look at the screen and you see this cross. And then for 2000 milliseconds, you get the word crack. And then here you have to respond, what the color of the name, right? You don't respond to the name, you process it. And then if you do well, you get money. So for every run of this task, whenever you do well, and you press yellow for crack, you get money. Or if you press yellow for the word table, you get money. Okay? So you could imagine that drug-addicted individuals have a different response to the word crack than people who never used crack. Right? And so indeed, it is a way to test whether there is a response that is unique to crack users. And how do they process the word crack versus people who do not take crack? And so just to look at group differences in the whole brain, okay, if you look at the whole task, how the whole task affects the whole brain, then you can notice circuits. So you can see here that there's the default mode network. Back then, we didn't call it that. We called it deactivation. Okay? So in fMRI, and that's very important to say, in fMRI, everything is relative. So when you see an increase in bold signal, which is demarcated here in the red and the yellow, an increase is relative to something that's happening at a different time, at a different condition. There is no absolute measure for fMRI. It's always relative to another condition. That's important to remember. And so when people are resting, the default mode network is active. And from that default mode network, you need to respond to the task. Wherever you've been before, you need to respond from that point. And so we're seeing that, generally control subjects and drug-addicted individuals, in terms of the main activation of the brain to the task, have comparable results. So they're processing the task, they're reading the words, they're performing, just like controls. But the only difference is in the condition of cognitive conflict. In other words, within the condition where you see the word crack versus a neutral word, and you have to respond with the color of the word, you're reading the word crack, and that creates a cognitive conflict that activates the dorsal anterior cingulate. The same region that I've shown you before have gray matter decrements. And so the more activation in the rostral cingulate, the more you're processing the difference in the word. And you can see here the bold signal in cocaine-addicted individuals and in control subjects. And this is the pattern of results we get a lot. So it's not just that we find that they have less gray matter in this dorsal cognitive conflict region in the cingulate, but they also have less activity in that region during cognitive conflict. Okay? And they also have less of that activity during emotion regulation. So and the emotion regulation part has to do with the more rostral cingulate. The dorsal cingulate has to do with cognitive conflict, the cognitive conflict element of executive functions. And the more rostral cingulate has to do with emotion regulation. Why it has to do with emotion regulation? Now we postulate that it has to do with the default mode network. So a person's inner world, inner experience from which they perform the task. Because when I ask you to perform a neuropsychological task, you really have to suppress your inner experience in that moment. Maybe you're thinking about something really bad, someone died. But you need to suppress that in order to perform well in the task. And so it's always, performance and results using fMRI, always relative to another condition relative to, usually, to your inner experience. And so if you look at weekly alcohol consumption, okay, and you seeing here training to reduce attention bias, it is possible to reduce attention bias to alcohol. In other words, it is possible for a person to apply cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral type of thinking in order to reduce the bias to alcohol cues. So if, for example, you know that you're going to the bar, okay, and you know that other people will be drinking, and you know that you cannot drink, you have to somehow do something to reduce your response, okay, to alcohol, your wanting of the alcohol. And you can do that by talking to yourself, okay, saying to yourself, there are different strategies. You can distance yourself from something that is very salient to you. You distance yourself. Or you can argue yourself away from it. And so there are ways to do that. And there are ways also to test if it was successful. And we have some studies that we're doing now. Now we're doing imaging studies at this point, at this point, at this point, at this point. So while a person is getting training to reduce attention bias, we image the brain. And I don't think I have the results here, but we will have them perhaps next year. So before I move on, if someone has a question. No.
You mentioned drug-related cues, but apart from the script test that you mentioned, did you use any other type of visual cues?
Yeah, and I will show you that in the future slides. So hold on to that. Anything else before I move to the next? Another problem in drug addiction is not just that the drug becomes very, very important, but also that other rewards become less important. So there is a reshuffling of hierarchy. The drug takes the first place and everything else sort of drops to the background, okay? And so even things like money become less important to you. And this is a study that Rita Goldstein designed from Wolfram Schultz's work. And Wolfram Schultz demonstrated that neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex respond not just simply to reward, but to relative reward. And so you have this monkey, and the monkey likes cereal. It's food. But the monkey likes apple more than cereal. And the monkey likes raisins even more than apple, okay? And so there's a hierarchy of reward here. And the orbitofrontal cortex, which people say is involved in decision making, its neurons respond to the relativity of the reward, not to the reward itself. So we said to ourselves, okay, so how do we apply this in humans? Using money, because money is important. More money is more important. Less money is less important. It's a sort of a good continuous measure, right, of reward. And we even thought to ourselves, okay, money is very important to addicts, right? Because with money, they can buy drugs. And so we thought this is a good way to gauge reward perception in drug-addicted individuals. So we created a functional MRI task. It's a neuropsychological task that you give while the person is inside the MRI. And we test the bold signal. We test fluctuations in the bold signal. And the subjects or the individuals receive actual money. And so when they perform, and they perform well, it's a very easy task to perform. You press the button every time you see certain rewards. and you get money at the end of the task. So you're very motivated to conduct this task. It's a forced choice task that engages attention and working memory, and it's not very demanding, okay? And so when we looked at a small group of subjects, control subjects, we saw all the regions of the brain that react to reward, right? So 0 money is more important than, or 45 cents are more important than 0 money, of course. And so the condition where they saw 25 cents and they knew they're going to get those 45 cents, the circuit of the reward network was activated. You have the anterior cingulate, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the midbrain. You know, you could say, oh, dopaminergic, thalamus. And using the same threshold in drug-addicted individuals, there was nothing. There was no response. In other words, again, threshold, okay? So if we reduce the threshold, okay, we will see the activity of the reward network. But we have to significantly reduce it, which means that control subjects have a stronger effect than cocaine-addicted individuals. And of course, that correlates with anhedonia as well. We repeated this experiment many times afterwards, and other groups repeated the experiment. And when you repeat the experiment with event-related potential, this is work by Muhammad Parvaz, when you repeat the experiment in event-related potential, you can see on the surface of the brain in control subjects, okay, you can see that there is differences, okay, between 0 cents, okay, it has less response, the least response, right? 1 cent and 45 cents. You see the hierarchy of the sensitivity to reward. 45 cents more important than 1 cent. And 1 cent is money, so it's up there. But 0 cents is down there, right? But when you do the same experiment in cocaine-addicted individuals, okay, you don't, it's all lumped together. You don't really see, okay, the separation of the effects according to the hierarchy of reward. And so there's a sort of a bluntness in terms of the sensitivity to reward. You don't see the sensitivity here while you see it here. And now with EEG, we don't know where it is in the brain because we don't have the same resolution as we do with MRI, okay? So with the MRI, we can see where the effects were, okay? With EEG, we just know that it's in the more prefrontal surface of the brain. Okay, yes?
I'm just wondering, for the first study, are those voxels in the thalamus specific to a specific nucleus, or was it just generally the thalamus?
Preclinical studies can perhaps show that, but we cannot. Because although the thalamus is quite large, it's a very nice region that you can say, okay, it's in the lower thalamus, etc. But you can't really say which nucleus it is. I do not. Some people do. I do not say because the resolution does not allow me to say. So, but I can say there are preclinical studies that found that this region of the thalamus, so maybe it is this region again. And so that's how we rely on the preclinical studies. You know, that's how it's important to do. That's an example. Your question is an example of back translation. Okay, so we have this finding, and we want to know, okay, what's going on there? Can we design a clinical rodent study that can get into that? Another way is also to do a 7T scans of the thalamus. A 7T scan of the thalamus can allow us to get more into detail. Yes?
I was just going to ask if you can't resolve it because there aren't clear landmarks that you can see in your representations, or because the subregions are too small.
I would say it's a resolution problem, so that the subregions are small And the radius of effect, we don't really know what is the radius of effect. And so I prefer not to talk about, regions more than, let's say, the hypothalamus, thalamus, like that. I mean, I've seen some people, reporting fMRI, and they talk about the amygdala, the nucleus of the amygdala and stuff like that, and I don't feel comfortable with that. So it depends on the brain region and where it is. In the prefrontal cortex, I think there's more, it's a larger region, and we talk more about different subregions. So attention bias is not only to words, of course, but also to images. Images are very powerful. And another good thing about images is that they're not education dependent. So, people who are less educated, more educated, the ability to read might vary, etc. But here, when you use images, pictures, it's not education dependent, and that can be very important. So this is an event-related study by Muhammad Parvaz and Dunning at Stony Brook University. And it's a very simple study because we presented pictures to people. Some pictures are pleasant, considered to be pleasant, like these pictures, and sad pictures, okay? And neutral pictures, and drug pictures. Actually, the drug pictures we took from actual participants who agreed, showing us how they use a drug. Not with real drug, pretend, but. And so you're able to show, while the people are on EEG, you're able to show them these pictures, okay? And you're able to show where there's activation in the brain, or here we're not going to call it activation, but where there's response in the brain. So here in the red, you can see that the response is concentrated, this is the nose, supposedly. So this is the front of the brain. So the response is concentrated in this area. And so, again, we speculated, okay, that just like the response for money, in cocaine-addicted individuals, they'll respond, just like controls respond to pleasant pictures, okay? Cocaine-addicted individuals will respond to the drug as pleasant pictures more than, because there's sort of a replacement of the reward by the drug. Of course, unpleasant pictures are also very important, that they will also garner the response of that prefrontal part of the brain. Why? Because they're also salient. It's about the salience, not necessarily the reward. We try to steer away from the word reward. It's more salience, because it could be for bad things, not just good things, right? And controls did not respond to cocaine. So cocaine pictures are like neutral pictures for them, Many people don't even know what this person is doing, really. Okay? So how did addicted individuals respond? How the scalp will look like in addicted individuals for pleasant versus neutral pictures. What do you think? Less than control for pleasant pictures? Are you sure? Less? You're right. Less than controls. You see, the pictures are still pleasant, but it's less so than controls. And also for unpleasant. Okay? But look at this effect. This is for cocaine versus neutral images. So in control individuals, there's pretty much no effect, just like if they would see a neutral image. But for cocaine images, there's an effect that's very similar to how controls respond to the pleasant or to the unpleasant images, okay? So the salience of the image for them is different than for controls. And you can show that in event-related potentials. Okay, neutral. Recovery with abstinence and intervention. Again, I'm coming back to recovery, and I'm going to show you some data, some recovery data. Because beyond abstinence, you know, I showed you abstinence, right? But beyond abstinence, there's also intervention, and you asked me about it. You asked, what if we can enhance their cognitive capacity? What if we can do this? What about CBT? Okay? How can we enhance recovery? And one of the ways in which recovery can be enhanced is by giving an enhancer, a cognitive enhancer, and I'm going to show you some data. This is a really good meta-analysis by Anna Konova, our postdoc, who's now assistant professor. No, actually, she was a graduate student in our lab. She published so much that it's hard for me to call her a graduate student. But she's a graduate student in our lab, and now she's a postdoc at NYU. And she did this really good meta-analysis of neuroimaging studies of interventions in drug addiction. So if you want more of a review of what's been going on, this is a pretty good one. And what you can find, what you can see, is that there are pharmacological interventions that have effects on different brain regions, on the reward circuit, if you will, or the salient circuit. And there are cognitive-based interventions that have similar effects, okay? But one effect that is sort of available in the pharmacological intervention and absent in the cognitive-based intervention is concentrated in the brainstem. So we think, okay, it's sort of a dopaminergic agent that might be enhancing this midbrain effect. But what if we do both? What if we give people cognitive therapy while they're taking Ritalin? Would there be a synergistic effect? I don't have an answer for that, by the way. So if you do conjunction analysis of all the effects, you can see here again that both cognitive therapy and pharmacological interventions target the prefrontal cortex, regions in the prefrontal cortex, and actually the ventral striatum also. And these nodes in the default mode network, like the precuneus. But more so than pharmacological interventions, cognitive-based interventions target the anterior cingulate, according to this review. So what if you give addicts, cocaine-addicted individuals, stimulant addicts, what if you give them stimulants? Perhaps if they're addicted to stimulants, they need stimulants. So why not give it to them? So what we did here is we tested how methylphenidate that blocks the dopamine transporters and increases extracellular dopamine, how that can be helpful for people with cocaine addiction. Because methylphenidate increases the salience of any stimuli, whether it's food, math, tasks, anything that requires cognitive capacity, methylphenidate increases. Methylphenidate also bolsters the cognitive functions by improving the signal-to-noise ratio and optimizing activity in the brain regions that support accurate task performance. Now, we're talking about oral methylphenidate, 1 20-milligram pill of Ritalin, let's say, which is a very basic and sometimes subclinical intervention. So oral methylphenidate decreases risk-taking in ADHD individuals, right? Because most of the data on methylphenidate we have with people with ADHD. And in individuals with ADHD, adults and adolescents, it decreases risk-taking while also improving inhibitory control, okay? in these psychopathologies that impact the prefrontal integrity or the prefrontal cortex. It's also helpful in TBI, stroke, dementia, frontotemporal dementia. So the hypothesis we had was that methylphenidate will improve brain and behavior function in cocaine addiction if it's administered at a low oral dose in combination with a laboratory challenge. And so this is what we did. We used the same task. You remember the task, okay? We used the same task in drug-addicted individuals and controls where we gave them methylphenidate versus placebo in a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, okay? And what we found that under methylphenidate, there was a change in the bold signal in the dorsal cingulate. And we actually called it normalization. There's been normalization of the rostral cingulate to the level of control subjects. So by using methylphenidate, we were able to bring the cocaine-addicted individuals to the level of prefrontal activity of control subjects. That's the rostral cingulate that I showed you before that has less gray matter and is less responsive in cocaine-addicted individuals versus controls. And so there's fortification of that signal. So you have the rostral cingulate here, which is more of the emotional region, and the dorsal cingulate, the more cognitive region. And so we wanted to test whether this effect also is prevalent in the networks. In other words, does methylphenidate, does it strengthen the resting state functional connectivity? Okay. And we were able to show that that same region that we were showing before in the dorsal cingulate, okay, that there is increased response, but not just increased response, also increased connectivity to the other brain regions. So there's more strengthening of this cognitive circuit. And we do not find that, and we do not find that in the placebo condition. And also that effect is related to the addiction severity. Yes?
Do you think this may tap into the psychiatric comorbidities with addiction, with, for example, ADHD? That this could be the reason why it has this effect on these individuals?
Yes, I mean, drug addiction is associated with a larger pathology, you know, the externalizing psychopathologies. And so the brain, I suspect, does not know the psychiatric categories. It knows more the continuous symptoms, okay, inattention, anger, sadness, impulsivity, you know, these types of effects rather than the whole category. We use categories because it helps us. But very, very often, the children who have ADHD are more at risk to later develop at a different time in their lives, right? After adolescence, to develop drug addiction. And so it is related. And the cognitive capacity, the undermined cognitive capacity is something that's in common to many, many psychiatric disorders. It's almost like an element that is impaired in, I would say, most psychopathologies, especially the externalizing psychopathologies. Okay? So, okay, so we know the drugs are not good for the brain, and you lose gray matter, and you know there's impairment in the brain networks and all of that. And there's so many reasons to stop using drugs. There's so many good reasons. But what if you're not aware that you're addicted? You're not either aware that you're addicted or not aware that you're addicted, but again, it's on a continuum. So I'm sure you notice that there are a lot of people who say, I don't need help. I'm not addicted. And they're standing in front of you drunk, right? So, so around 95% of people say that they do not feel they need treatment. And they're not all correct. So there's these very few people who say that they need treatment, But then again, only 1%, they felt they needed treatment, but they also made the effort to receive treatment. So poor insight into illness is a very important issue. It's studied in many disorders, such as schizophrenia, for example. And it's being studied now in drug addiction. So how do you do that? How do you study? How do you show that one person has very poor insight into their disorder and another person has better insight? I mean, you could ask them, do you have good insight? Are you an addict? And they'll say yes, they'll say no, but maybe they're trying to make you feel better, or they know they're in an experiment about addiction, so they'll say yes. Or maybe they're antagonistic, so they'll say no. Okay? It's called demand characteristics. It's when your subject kind of understands what you're looking for and either tries to give it to you, or being antagonistic tries not to give it to you. Okay? So we need a measure that is objective. We need an objective measure to see insight into illness, to gauge it, to test it, assess it. Because addiction is a stigmatized disorder, right? Nobody wants to admit that they have addiction. What am I doing? Sorry. I'm cluing you in for the task. So there is some denial, okay? There is some denial. And instead, it could be thought of not as denial, but impaired awareness. Impaired awareness of the severity of the disorder and the deficits, okay? And that, in turn, this poor insight is attributable to neural dysfunction. And so, for example, there is something called anosognosia. You're not aware that you have a problem somewhere in the brain. That's from neurology. But in psychiatry, it's called poor insight into illness. And in schizophrenia, for example, it's very, very prevalent.
Just wondering how this relates to sort of what might be a flip side of it, which is just a lot of lying. And I know with alcoholics, that's pretty clearly going on. But with other...
And confabulation, not just lying.
Yeah, all kinds of, deceptions directed inward and outward. But
yeah.
I'm wondering, first of all, is that at all related to the lack of self-awareness? Or are they two different, sort of
domains?
Constructs? Yeah, domains. And then also, does that generalize to cocaine addicts, for example? That, just...
Yeah. I mean, people vary in their appreciation of the disease and its symptoms. People vary. So you'll have people who are more aware, less aware. But you're right, there's a lot of deception and there's a lot of lying. But I don't know whether that is related to this poor insight or not. Very much depends on how you define things, right? How you operationally define it at the end of the day. What is insight? How do you operationally define insight in such a way that you can really talk about it as insight or poor insight? And the way we chose to do it is to look at the discrepancy between your choice and what you reported to be your choice. Okay? And that's, to us, the more discrepancy between what you reported and what your actual choice, the more the discrepancy, the worse the insight. Does that make sense? I can give you an example. This is called an implicit task. It was developed by Scott Mahler, who's an assistant professor in our lab now. And what he did was very simple. There's decks of cards, just like with the IO gambling task that I showed you before. And the decks show pictures, images. Some are pleasant images, some are unpleasant images. And the game is rigged in such a way that it's all mixed, okay? But there is a there are decks of cards that show more of drug images versus other images, okay? And the person is very simply chooses a card, a deck, let's say deck 3, and he sees an image. And he can see the image longer versus shorter period of time, okay? And then he chooses another deck, and he sees another picture, okay? Now, the decks are rigged in such a way that, for example, the drug pictures are on deck 2. They don't know that. They just press, and they see images, and they press, and they see images, right? They don't know that mostly in deck 2, they will see drug images. And mostly in deck 3, they will see pleasant images of the view, okay? This is cut. So at the end of the task, we ask them, okay, so what did you choose? What did you choose? What images did you choose? And then we look to see what might be the discrepancy between what they said they chose and what they actually chose. And people, you'd be surprised, controls, are pretty accurate on this task. Why is it implicit? Because they don't really know what we're testing, okay? So then we ask them, what kinds of picture do you think you chose to look at most often? Was it this picture or this picture, okay? So healthy controls were pretty accurate, close to the 90%, see? And then you had abstinent cocaine users, treatment seekers, around the 70%. And then you have current cocaine users, people who are using now. Okay? And you see the almost dose response inaccuracy. Okay? So we also wanted to look, of course, at the bold signal change in the cingulate. Okay? We didn't know it would be in the cingulate. Again, that's very important to point out. All of the studies that we're doing are whole brain studies. In other words, we asked the computer, okay, to choose where the effects are according to the statistical measurement matrix, okay? And of course, the types of tasks that we target, that we develop, are types of tasks that will target the prefrontal cortex. But we don't know for sure if it will. We ask the whole brain, and these are results that we get. Okay? So you have people who have impaired insight, unimpaired insight, and controls. Okay? So there are cocaine-addicted individuals that were not impaired in their insight. In other words, there was not a discrepancy between what they reported they looked at and what they actually looked at. Okay? But there are people who are impaired. And you can see that the bold signal in this rostral cingulate, which is more of an emotional type of region, if you will, there's differences just based on this grouping of impairment of insight. Do you understand this? I mean, is this clear? And the more bold signal change, right, in this region, the more days of the week that they used cocaine. Okay? So these individuals who had impaired insight, okay, the more bold signal in that direction, okay, which is here, the more bold signal in this direction, the more days of the week that they use cocaine. So that's an assessment of severity of the drug use, right? We also wanted to look at gray matter, and I showed you before results with gray matter, right? It's different than results with functional bold signal. So it's not just that their bold signal is impaired, but you also see here that they have, the ones with the poor insight, they have less gray matter in that same region. Other studies that sort of approximate insight into illness and measuring it in different ways, different fashion, find similar results, again, in the rostral or dorsal cingulate. Very similar results. And in other disorders, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia. This is our current results. And this is in cannabis abusers. So let's summarize everything I just said, and then we can have a little session of questions so that I can show different slides that depend on your questions, okay? So I showed you that there's cognitive impairment that is associated with prefrontal integrity and function. There are effects of chronicity of use, right? How many years of drug use? There are effects of abstinence versus treatment. I showed you also data showing attention bias to drug-related cues in cortical and subcortical regions. And I showed you that there's a modified neural sensitivity to money and rewards and non-drug stimuli in cocaine-addicted individuals. So it's not just that there's more salience to the drug cues, there's also reduced salience to other cues that are emotional. And there are similar results in people with alcoholism. And this modified neurosensitivity to reward is associated with the degree of craving. So there's reduced prefrontal activation to other non-drug reinforcers, okay? So for example, video showing erotic movies versus a video showing cocaine movies, people taking cocaine. And the value of the drug reward, but not the value of the non-drug reward, is changing. Okay, so the value of the drug reward is going up, while the value of the non-drug reward is going down. And the more there's this discrepancy, the more the addiction can be severe. Hijacking the brain, if you will. There are adaptations to supraphysiological stimulation by the drugs, okay? What do I mean by supraphysiological? So if you think of dopamine in response to food versus dopamine in response to cocaine, it's a very different trajectory. And you can read about it in Dr. Volkov's and Fowler's many papers and reviews. So there's a compromised sensitivity to relative reward, and that underpins impaired decision making. Okay, like for example, trading your car for a couple of cocaine hits. Okay. And of course, there's also empirical evidence for depression and anhedonia in addicted individuals. And the prefrontal cortex is hyporesponsive or hyposensitive to rewards. And that's correlated with reduced self-report of inhibitory control. It's correlated with impulsivity, traits of impulsivity. And evidence also suggests that impaired perception to the drive in addiction is related to impaired insight into illness, like the work of Scott Moeller that I showed you. These are, this is a good paper. It's a bit old, but there are other papers now that have replicated, many other papers have replicated the effect. But this is highly recommended. It's a review paper that really describes the phenomenology and the data around impaired insight in drug addiction. Okay, so I'm going to stop now for a little while so that you can ask questions or let me know what you would like for me to talk about.